Well, this is the Sunday after what was once a major feast in the Episcopal Church, which is Ascension Day. So we don't usually keep Ascension Day on the Thursday of this past week when it falls, but instead, if you will, transfer it to the Sunday after, and hence our Ascension Day hymns that we're singing today. And Ascension Day for me is not so much celebrating the historical narrative of the rise of Jesus from this earth after being with his disciples post-resurrection and ascending into heaven to be with God. But it's more about, for me, resonating with the idea of looking for God and watching and paying attention and being attentive to our vision of where we see Jesus. As our eyesight in the story follows him up to heaven, I think we're called to see Jesus in our lives and ask how and where we see Jesus. Well, I was reminded of this as an Episcopalian this past week. I don't know about all of you, but for those of you on Facebook, you'll sometimes get some very strange suggestions as to what might interest you based on your previous viewing. And up popped this week a posting by a fellow named Atheist Andy. And the posting was entitled, "Why I Hate the Episcopal Church." So I thought, I'm in. So I watched it, and what Andy does is he goes to different denominations and then critiques them based on how absolutely ridiculous it is to believe in God. Well, he went to the Episcopal Church in downtown Raleigh, North Carolina, and it's a very typical Episcopal church in many ways, being a big stone Gothic building in the middle of downtown, well known for their music program. And what turns out, much to my amusement, is that Atheist Andy kind of writes a love letter to the Episcopal Church based on his experience. He loved the beauty of the architecture, its soaring Gothic arches, the beauty of not only the building, but the liturgy, which seems so intentional and planned. He loved the music, and he also loved the welcome and the sense of being at peace in this place. Pretty amazing. But of course, he had to say something. So he said his only criticism really was that he came away from the service thinking that because there was no evidence of great angst and torture in the participants in the service, that they seemed a little bit perhaps too comfortable and at ease with each other. He came from a fundamentalist background himself, and he didn't quite know what to make about the Episcopalians seeming so unified in their worship. Well, I wanted to write Atheist Andy and say, you need to get to a few more Episcopal churches just to see how much people disagree with each other very often. But all appearances to the contrary, yes, it does look very much as a unity. And we kind of have that expectation of unity. Certainly, John knocks us over the head with the word, "we are one," in today's gospel. It raises an expectation of, if not total agreement, then at least consensus as who we are as a people of faith. But I have to say, my experience of parishes is that there are many, many differences in people, and that's to be expected in any human institution. In the Episcopal Church, very often it's relatively small things like people's favorite hymns, or, God forbid, any changes in the church furnishings of the building. But those differences and our differences of opinion on that level are not what I want to think about this morning. Instead, I want to think about differences and how we approach difference if we're not truly all united in the same perspective. How do we overcome profound differences among us? And I was thinking about this really in terms of a sermon I heard yesterday at the cathedral down in New York City. Bishop Mary Glasspool, wonderful person, a great friend, is retiring as the Assistant Bishop of New York. And I went down to the service celebrating her ministry, and it was a great day. The preacher that Mary chose is a woman priest named Carter Haywood, and Carter is a really well-known figure in the Episcopal Church. She taught for many years at the Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge, and also was one of the original 11 women who were ordained in the Episcopal Church in 1974. She has a reputation for being outspoken, and she didn't disappoint. In her sermon yesterday, which made me question and be uncomfortable with her perspective, she talked about differences in opinion, differences that are based in politics. And she then launched into a sermon in which she judged and dismissed most of the people who disagree with her politically. She may have thought she was preaching to the choir, but she wasn't. And it raised in my question whether she was not into what she was saying, all well-intentioned, I'm sure, and a deep love of Mary. But the words that she spoke seemed to me to galvanize the divisions rather than moving forward. And it was frankly partisan. And I think there is never any place for partisan politics in faith communities. So I wondered and thought about this idea of judging and dismissing, that we therefore simply reject out of hand people based on their beliefs, their judgments, their own values, and whether there might not be some other way of approaching difference rather than half of the United States dismissing the other half. She, of course, didn't address that. But it gave me pause for thought. And I thought, as I thought during the sermon, maybe a way forward is not so much that we look at our political differences. And she did make the point that political decisions from time to time, and perhaps often, have moral and ethical effects and repercussions. And what is the church if the church doesn't address moral and ethical issues? But they're not based in partisan politics, but they're based in the gospel, what Jesus commands us to do. So I was thinking, very, very seldom does Jesus sit in judgment on anyone. He engages people and often asks them a question. First off, will often say, what is it that you seek? What are you afraid of? Who are you? An invitation to deeper relationship. So I was thinking during this very long sermon that I would really make a practice of stepping away from judgment. That I would do my best to try to engage with people not in what I perceived or understood to be their views, but actually who they are on a deeper level. Now, I believe very much that God is present in our daily lives, and that God hears us and very often has to smack us around a little bit. Because coming into this tremendous spiritual insight that I got during the sermon, I then went to communion. And of course, at the cathedral, this beautiful setting for services, we all went up for communion and we came back. And we were in the front, and I couldn't see everyone who was in front of me on my side. But as I came back from communion and then resumed my seat, I noticed that there was a young man who was in the very front. I couldn't see his face. And he was bent over with his head touching the floor in prayer following communion. And I have to say, it annoyed me. It annoyed me because I thought someone should tell this young man how Episcopalians are after communion. They may go back and kneel and say a brief prayer. They then may sit back and see who else is in church that Sunday. This unseemly, almost Buddhist posture of prayer not only got in the way of people trying to get up to communion, but just seemed so out of place. It really deeply annoyed me. And here comes the painful part of the story. So as we rose for the final hymn, I looked over to this young man who had stood up, and it was Bishop Matthew's son. Now, Jack has been here to St. Peter's. He came in October for confirmation. He's a young man who is on the spectrum of development. And I thought, you know, Richard, shame on you. Not your best moment. How quickly you went to judge this person from your own understanding and perspective rather than their story and context. And how unlike the gospel that is. So while I'm not going to assume that position after communion today, I will remember when we're gathered together as community that we all have our own stories. And it's up to us to try to hear them and know them before we rise to judgment. That rather than judgment, we base our relationship with each other in the classic tenets of the gospel: compassion, kindness, patience, deep commitment to one another and to community. And you know, I have no doubt that differences will continue, both in our nation and in our local faith communities. But I like and hope that that won't be based in judgment. That instead we follow the gospel call to hear the story that's behind each of us, the things that we may all be afraid of, the ways that we've come to see a way forward for ourselves. Because I think if we remain in judgment on one another, nothing will go forward in a good way. Only in that we're able to hear one another, to listen to them, and to treat one another and the people of the world with the way that the gospel would have us be. It was a great reminder yesterday that when we ask ourselves, where is God? Where is Jesus? This profound being of love that has ascended into the heavens. It's sometimes helpful to remember that they might be sitting right next to us in church. Amen.